Right, sitting down. Okay. Thank you so much.
Go for it.
Let's start by sharing some of your experiences over the last few minutes with this or everything around it.
I thought about whether you were watching it on the computer or reading your email.
I wanted to know where the patterns came from, and tried to find, a connection between the sound and the visuals that maybe would give me a clue.
I love the visuals. I think they're really cool, but the sound was like, I'm not really like it.
I think either or separate would be cool, but together it just gave me a headache. I'm like, oh, I can't get that. Like the sound and visual were like overwhelming.
Did anyone else have like a visceral reaction of some sort?
I thought, wee. I like the sound circles.
Yeah, I never, it seemed like I could feel it also. Like I was kind of inside it, I guess.
Any guesses as to how it was made or might have been made?
certainly reminds me of spirograph. You guys ever do that before? The gears and the take the disc.
Any other guesses?
I kind of thought of when they like had a speaker or something that put like maybe sand on it, like certain frequencies.
Yeah, yeah.
Like sound
Well, it turns out that the person who generated it, in fact, in the last week or two, I believe, is sitting right here. And maybe he could share some of his experience.
I can answer some of those questions. Well, yeah, how it was made. This is nothing more than analog video feedback. I don't know how many of you have pointed a camera at a screen that the camera is feeding its own signal into and get that recursive pattern that goes into infinity. It's nothing more than that, but highly controlled. This is basically what happened when I was just sitting in my room one night, and I had, old 70s equipment, black and white TV, and a video camera from the 70s, and just pointed it there and got all the lighting conditions correct, and just had fun with it. And all the interesting sort of worminess of it is just came from introducing static. When you tune off of the station a little bit, you get a little bit of white noise. And that, if you put into this iterative process, generates all these really neat kind of swirly things. All the audio actually came directly from the video signal. In an analog video signal, it's that old way of doing a picture is painting it a line at a time. And the brightness of that line is basically a waveform. You can plug that into an audio device and capture the audio from that. And it sounds terrible. I ran it through some filters to make it a little better, but it's very abrasive. And but I thought, run with it. You can turn off the sound because it's a lot nicer of an experience without it. But I thought I'd include it just to have some sort of sound. And it's, all the sound is procedurally generated from the video, which I thought was neat. But yeah, it's rather unpleasant to listen to. I agree. And yeah, that's basically it. Anyone have any other questions about it? Yes.
I kind of just like a link projected on my wall at night.
This is a video link playing right now.
Excellent. Like,
yeah.
Could you
we
post
can
it
set it up.
Yeah,
I'll
thank
post
you.
it on the. Yeah, so one thing that I found really fascinating about this is its relationship to noise. So the fact that static is a very kind of formative part of making this pattern. We think of static as being as random as possible, and yet with one minor interaction, taking a camera and pointing it to a visual of that camera, creating one simple connection can generate kind of a multitude of forms, and not only that, forms that we somehow can resonate to. This concept of noise interacting with the world to create structure is, I think, a very fundamental part of today's lecture, and was also touched on in the reading. So you think of our current models of how physics relates to chemistry, relates to biology. At the very basic level, you have these atoms that are jiggling around in apparently a completely random way. So what is it about these completely random structures that, when put into feedback loops that are admittedly much, much more multi-layered than this one, can generate something like the world that we inhabit? And it's kind of a very, very complex topic, and we're just going to give you kind of a tiny glimpse of certain ways of viewing these issues today. And so before we get into the meat of things, I just want to kind of reconnect with some of the logistics of the course, mainly the course projects. So I imagine all of you are well under your way to creating some masterpiece that will blow your socks off and those of all your classmates. But to witness this process, all of us are kind of offering our services, and ideally will be there to meet with you next week. And what we found in the past is these meetings can actually save you a lot of time, and that's because a lot of times we start off with really, really ambitious projects, and then within the course of weeks, we realize that, oh, there's midterms, and actually this project is much more complex than I realized. So a lot of times it can be really helpful to talk to either your peers or advisors about, what is really fundamental in this project? What can I leave out? What is critical to it? And so a lot of times I found that discussions can really help simplify the type of directions that the project takes, and ultimately kind of condense it into something that you can finish in the few weeks that we have. So I see most of you with your eyes like, and I'm sorry I can't compete in terms of aesthetics being kind of another point that we'll touch on as we bring in a composer to talk about how do we think about aesthetics in some sort of formal, productive, professional sense. So with that, I'll hand it over to Georgianne to kind of kick off the festivities.
All right, so I just wanted to kind of recap last week and sort of link together last week's, or 2 weeks ago, discussion with today. And so the last class, we talked about neuromodulation, and we focused on this idea that neuromodulation is a diffuse signal that floods the brain and acts on many neurons at once, which is very different from the one-to-one neuron communication you have in neurotransmission. And we specifically focused on serotonin as a neuromodulator that is thought to affect mood. And then we jumped into a discussion of how many of our social interactions also rely on these large-scale neuromodulators. But as I was reflecting on our last class, I realized we were all sitting around here talking about mood as though it's something we're in control of. And so my question to you now is, do you think you're in control of your emotional state? And to what extent are you in control? So does anyone have thoughts about that?
I'd say there definitely times when we can get out of control of our moods. Because especially if you're waking up from a dream and the dream has some sort of content that makes you feel a certain way, sometimes it's really hard to shake that even when you wake up and go back to your normal state of consciousness.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
I definitely don't think they're in control. I think everything, the environment, people, everything around us just definitely affect us, and that would predict whether we are in good or in bad mood. I mean, we definitely have some physiological changes that could get us in bad mood because we're sick or something, but the environment plays a huge factor in whether we're happy or upset or sad or whatever.
Do most people agree that environment plays a big factor in your mood? Do you think you have any control over your mood?
I was going to say, I think it's kind of a spectrum, because there's certainly times where I feel very in control of how I am, other times where not so much, but it's also a degree. It's not like you're ever completely out of control or can completely control everything going on in your brain.
It reminds me of one of those past projects I was posting on DSpace, where that group of kids sent themselves reminders, or smile at this time of day, or act angry, and eventually it just started really messing with their heads, and it really worked. So yeah, I would agree that it's more of a spectrum.
Yeah, I was just going to say, with regards to mood and the environment, I feel like I read a part of a book by Deepak Chopra, and he mentioned that the whole notion of the environment being sort of separate from you is something that we've sort of taken on and accepted, but that's not necessarily true. In fact, he argues that in some sense the environment is a part of you. Why do you see the environment as something different from you? Where you are is a very significant component of, in some sense, who you are. So I feel like, even personally, when I go to different places, sort of automatically my thoughts change, and I feel like I don't have much control over it. So yeah, that's what I think.
And also on that note, I have to definitely agree that you are definitely in the environment. but you have some control over that as well. I mean, you can change your environment, or you can change, whatever you're taking into your body. You can control those things. And your body sort of kind of can learn drugs and learn what it likes and what it doesn't like and how to achieve certain moods. So in some sense, you have more control than you might know.
I guess one could flip that too and say that perhaps we have less control than we think. So in some sense, you're in control of what you're saying. In another sense, it's completely dictated by the construct of this classroom, the fact that Georgianne posed this question, and the way that we think of grammar, all of these details that have been kind of enmeshed that we take for granted. And so I wonder, what fraction of things that we think we are in complete control of is actually vertical.
Yeah, if we take this even more generally, do you think you're in control of your thoughts? And to be more clear about what I'm saying, we are constantly inundated with information, right? But only a very small fraction of that information crystallizes into the conscious thought. Do you think you have any control over what becomes conscious thought? Yes.
I think it's great that you're posing this question. For me personally in my life, because this is a recent question I kind of brought up to myself, is wondering if actions I take are consequences of my thoughts, or thoughts are kind of a precursor of something that's happened biologically, thought than action rather than, if that makes sense. I mean, thoughts are just byproducts of things that I not so.
Well, one of the question poses, can you control the conscious thoughts, right? And I know some people spend a lot of their lives trying to do that. At least, people who meditate and just sit there and try to let all the thoughts go and put it all in the subconscious do attempt to achieve some sort of control in there. And
So when I was really little, my brother would, I guess, try to mess with me by saying, "Don't think about an elephant. Hey, what are you thinking of?" But then I don't know, I guess to mess with him back, I started trying to train myself to really quickly think about something else, and I kind of got there. So then next time we did it, after several times, I said, I don't know what I was thinking of, but I switched it really fast. And I was being honest, so I think just some.
So because of the feedback,
yeah.
you created this. Yes.
Yeah, I was just going to say that I feel like we do to some degree have, so I feel like we do have some control over our thoughts. And the reason I say that is because I feel like when any sort of thing happens, suddenly, or something affects you, you have control over how you look at it. And I think just by changing the perspective on a certain thing, it's funny how the thing itself could change, The same thing, if you look at it in a different way, it could give you immense joy, and if you look at it in a different way, it could give you sadness, So, and that sort of hints at the point that we do have, to some extent, some control. So that's what
I would posit that it's more a process. It's not like we have control or we don't have control. Sort of one thing to learn in your life is how to get some amount of control, and then what amount of control you don't have, right, on your emotions, on your thoughts. Because if you don't sort of take part in this process, it seems like then your emotions run wild and they dictate who you are and what you do and how you feel. But you're able to get some control over them just by imposing your will. That's where will comes in.
Yeah, I don't necessarily believe this, but it goes along with what everyone said. I think it's called The Secret, and I don't know if it's a book or both. And basically it's saying that whatever thoughts you do have or do come up, you can choose to encourage them or suppress them to be whatever you want, happy, rich, poor, I don't know, an astronaut. And so it's saying that you do have control over your thoughts, maybe not something that just pops into your head. Like when someone says, don't think about purple elephants, I don't think you have control immediately, because then you do think of it, but you can choose to switch it or change it or manipulate that thought.
I wanted to jump into this sort of idea that we can test this almost with recent technological advances, we have brain-machine interfaces. And so the basic idea of a brain-machine interface is that you have a sensor that's recording the signals in your brain. You have a decoder that is determining what those signals in your brain mean. So for example, if you think about reaching your hand out to touch something, there are certain neurons in your brain that are active, and you can, over trials, determine and decode that signal. And then that decoder sends its signal to an external receiver, which is the third part of the brain-machine interface. And so this can be used to control a robot, for example, or a cursor on a computer screen. And so as one specific example of this, in the last few years, humans have been getting these brain implants after they lose control of their limbs. And they are able, with time and training, to learn to control a robotic arm. However, I was just looking at the numbers, and if they're over a few hundred trials after all the training, they only successfully grasp an object about 60% of the time. So even a very basic task like motor control is something that we have some control over, but it's also something you usually do without thinking, right? So these people have to kind of retrain themselves. And I think with that, I'll pass it over to Gavin to carry on with the class.
Yeah, so this issue of control is kind of very fundamentally linked to the issue of information, the issue of signals and noise, all of which the reading touched on. So we can kind of continue this conversation by asking what is noise? So if you had to define noise or come up with some sort of operational definition of noise, what would you say?
I would say it's some aspect of the signal that has no relevance to the decision you make of what to do when receiving it.
So something that's kind of irrelevant. So in the case that Georgianne framed, you could imagine the 40% of the time that this person couldn't control the arm, the system would consider that noise. It's kind of a failure mode of some sort. Any other thoughts?
Something with a pattern that's too complex to describe it. So I think that noise might have a pattern, it's just like really hard to get to it. And so anything that doesn't have a pattern, we tend to discard it as noise. But then many times later we come to find that there's actually meaning in it. We just didn't really know what it was.
I see. So this might actually touch on this idea of relevance, in the sense that relevance might be a concept that we define in terms of our understanding of something.
That's what I was going to say. I was going to say is, it does have a pattern, but it's something that is unpleasant to us. So we're like, oh, it's just noise. It's not like classical music, which follows certain patterns, and we found it really pleasant. So maybe it's just something that we are not accustomed to understanding and to hearing all the time, so we just categorize it as noise.
So I guess then we could go to the other extreme and say, is anything truly unpredictable? Is there anything that truly is completely random? If we accept this notion that possibly everything, maybe everything right now that we curse, many things that we consider to be noise are simply things that we don't understand yet.
I do think there exists random spontaneous pair production, and I think it is random, right? So, that's like in space, particles and antiparticles just come out and annihilate each other like that. And there seems to be absolutely no reason for it.
Benji, how would you consider that an exception to your?
Yeah. I mean, in the end, I think we're too limited to actually, with our like senses, with our dimensionality of thinking. There's so much out there that has structure, and we just can't perceive it. So like, you can always find examples of that. And so like, the more kind of techniques we get, or the more technically advanced we get, the more sort of we can probe what we used to think of as noise, and then figure out that there's meaning to it. The question of like, can there be randomness? it's philosophical, right? Like nobody has an answer to it. I think it might be that it's totally deterministic. I think Einstein used to think that too, right? He argued that there can't be any like room for. But yeah, he couldn't prove it either. So I believe that there is structure to most things that we call noise, but possibly not to everything.
Okay. So you're taking a safe stance.
Yeah, so just on the same point as Benji was saying, is that I think, randomness is subjective, but by subjective, you can, rephrase that word in an objective sense by saying it is relative to the system that is trying to understand that signal.
Okay, yeah, so many species, many animals are really seem to be very highly optimized to detect signals in the world. And this is kind of true in many different modalities. So this is a moth, something that may be about 2 inches long. And this is a male moth, and I can tell because it has these giant antennae which express millions of these proteins which detect single molecules from female moths. And these molecules may be emitted many, many miles away, and these male moths are capable of detecting single molecules of pheromones that happen to drift in their direction from miles away, and somehow actually make some sort of decision about how to get somewhere. So you think of this scenario and how the state-of-the-art scientific analysis of the world of this moth will posit there to be a very large amount of unpredictability, a very large amount of noise, and yet this simple creature is able to find the source of this seeming variability often enough to maintain its population. And so these kind of extreme optimalities in our sensation extend in many domains. So, for example, our retinas are able to sense on the order of 1 or 2 photons. So this is as kind of minimal amount of light as you can expose a retina to. And our system is so highly optimized that it can detect these quantum events. The same is true for the auditory system. You can detect vibrations that are on the scale of thermal fluctuation, meaning the vibration that this table is emitting just by virtue of being at room temperature is on the order of magnitude of the vibrations that our ears can sense. And this seems to also kind of extend itself into the world of patterns. So not only are we very good at detecting these very faint signals, we're good at detecting the meaning that these signals seem to embody.
So are you saying that it's possible to, in a sense, like, hear the temperature of the room?
So according to this theory, if there's fluctuations that are at that magnitude, so I think it would have to be variations that aren't constant. So it would have to be a slight deviation that has a certain structure. But that's just the kind of textbook statement that people talk about when they talk about the limits of auditory sensitivity. So as you're saying, it also is very context dependent. There's only certain situations in which you can do that. So right now, I'm kind of dominating your auditory system in a way that would prevent this from happening. Chances are you would need something like the echo location or the echo chamber that we were in. So now I'm going to give you an example of an auditory stimulus, and I'm going to challenge you to try to detect some sort of pattern in it. Okay, so how many people heard something that seemed like a pattern in that? Okay, pretty much everyone. Now, what I did to make this clip is I took a second of noise, white noise, static, something that might be generated by a TV, and I just repeated it. And this is kind of surprising because static is as random a signal as you can produce. And yet somehow your brain was able to find deviations in this completely random signal to be able to tell that it's repeating with a certain cadence. Does anyone want to share their experience of what that 45 seconds was like? Let's say compare the first part to the last part.
Like at the very beginning, it's like, oh, this is just nonsense. There's like nothing going on. But then when you get used to it, you're like, oh yeah, there's a pattern. And even further, you can even distinguish sort of a deviation within that pattern. So it's like, and then it's like, so like, I don't know how to make sympathetic sounds. Yeah, like that.
So something kind of layers unfolding in the signal that we might consider totally random.
Yeah.
I thought what was interesting is that at first, there was it was just random, and then I found like the long frequency, right? And then once I readapted to sort of like dividing it up into that long period, I found even shorter periods, within that had structure. So it went from like a hierarchy of just infinite period to 1 second to inside that 1 second, what patterns I was able to get.
Yeah.
I even ended up hearing words imaginarily in it, so I thought I was saying NyQuil over and over again, and I was bankrupt after that.
Yeah, in fact, there's the word on the street is that if you look at static for long enough, you start seeing all kinds of interesting things within. And for example, with a sound bite like this, one thing that I'm very curious about is how similar are people's experiences, given that the stream purportedly is comprised of white noise, complete static. Probably, not everyone, I imagine, heard the word NyQuil in the bite.
So a great little fact that really resonated with me when watching it is I use white noise sometimes to fall asleep as a sleep aid, especially if there's other noises around in the apartment or on the street. And can you imagine trying to fall asleep to that after having found the pattern? And it turns out that if the loop is like 30 seconds or a minute, or it's even harder to find the periodicity, even if you can't find it, it's still hard to fall asleep. And so white noise machines exist and are for sale because they don't loop. Whereas if you find a white noise sample online and you loop it to try to recreate one for free, it's still interval times.
Thank you, guys. I'm sorry, I'm still sounding. Hi, everybody. I'm Richard. Later, but just to this particular point, part of my role is as a sound designer for toys, for kids' toys. That's my day job. And to the point about noise and loops and what white noise machines. I remember a challenge that I had a couple of years ago was to develop a sleepy time toy for little kids to help them to go to sleep. And it's a very small chip with very little memory on it. And so I was given the task of creating loops of white noise that were less than 10 seconds long that would loop for 15 minutes. And so this whole question of finding the periodicity, finding the signal is very, very pertinent to trying to design those sounds. And it was just designing those loops. I think it took me about a month and a half to find the right balance between this signal and noise and the chaos and order. And it was a big challenge.
Yeah, I have a question to that. What's the solution? Do you just take clips of different length, stitch them together?
So the solution that I found to work the best was to take a multi-layered approach to the noise. So there were different kinds of noise playing at the same time. So for example, one of the categories was rain. So rain has a very kind of white noise-based sound, but rain on its own, if it's on that kind of loop, you're going to find periodicity very quickly. And so what I added into it was low rumbles of thunderstorms and leaves blowing at the same time. Just at second one, there was leaves blowing, and then at second four, there was a rumble. So, but very, very low mix, kind of almost buried, so that you could hardly hear it. So it just kind of became a subconscious thing that you weren't sure whether you heard it or not. And so that coupled with the constant noise of the brain seems to, it would extend the period before the aha moment of, oh, you know, I can't get it out of my head now, you know, that.
So reverse engineering a solution when you have a system that is so complex can prove really, really challenging. Does someone want to read this?
Sorry, just before we move on, why is it that it's difficult, or is there a reason that it might be difficult to fall asleep on this periodicity in the external environment?
Drew, do you have any kind of experience
Insights
with,
from personal?
why it's hard?
Like
My guess is that we're you were just talking about how exquisitely sensitive our visual system is and our auditory system. Another thing that we're incredibly good at, way better than just about every other species on this planet, is pattern recognition. And so it's something that we're very, very good at, and so it's very easy for us to do, and it occupies a sizable chunk of our brain. And so it may just be keeping us in an alert state by being presented with a stimulus that we're used to looking for.
I potentially have an answer to that question. As a musician, if there's something that has a repeating pattern, I automatically go into music mode and I start playing with it and thinking of it as something, and then my creativity gets going, and I want to add things in my head to it and start composing, you could say, just automatically in my brain. Even when there's a car alarm, sometimes I find myself drumming along to it. So that would keep your brain in a state that's maybe not the best for sleep.
And this is kind of a little bit of a paradox, because we're also very good at filtering things out. Like, how many of you are immensely explicitly aware of the floor during this conversation? Probably not too many of you. We have these mechanisms of kind of filtering things out as well. And so, what is the kind of state dependence, the context dependence of these relationships? All right, who's a good reader?
Read that. It doesn't matter in what order the letters in a word are. The only important thing is that the first and last letter be in the right place. The rest can be a total mess, and you can still read it without a problem. This is because the human mind does not read every letter by itself, but the word as a whole.
So I probably couldn't read that fast if it were not scrambled, so congratulations. Very well. And so this is kind of shows you just like how massively corrupted a signal can be and yet be completely interpretable. And it kind of reintroduces the notion of like what is signal and what is noise. Like how would you model the amount of information in something like this, using something like a dictionary?
Well, I mean, actually we only read like 2 or 3 words correctly, or maybe 4 or 5. I mean, so it depends on what the task is, right? Right? Because
do you want to elaborate on that?
Is the noise in the model that we have for images, or is it in the actual signal? Right? The signal was intended to be read by someone.
So maybe you should have said it diazit and the tire. Yeah, so sorry, you were totally wrong.
Either the noise is in the signal or it's in the interpretation.
Okay, so let's try that. Do you want to try reading this as it is?
It doesn't matter what or the tears in a word are the mean from the wrist and will sat tear get the right what total says and you can still sit right without it problem. Just as you say that go on minute just not right air day the tether by itself left but the right is a void.
Onward. Okay, so scientists have tried to come up with a framework of thinking about how much signal there is in any system, and this is a very ambitious task. And a real revolutionary breakthrough was made in 1948, actually in context of trying to decode encrypted signals that enemies might be sending to each other. And so You might have heard of Bell, the telephone company, which used to be around back in the day, and maybe still has some sort of incarnation. They used to have a lab, and this guy, Shannon, did kind of some beautiful, in some ways very simple analysis of how would you kind of operationalize the concept of signal and noise. And he imagined having two kind of entities, one a sender and one a receiver, and the sender passing a receiver a message, so you could imagine these two being two different cell phones. And inevitably, as the reading alluded to, there's always some sort of corruptive force that the signal is competing with. So, for example, in cell phone conversation, you might have heard the signal like chop up a little bit sometimes. You might hear like background noise from conversations on the street. The apparatus of compressing and replaying sounds itself is a highly reductive process. So the sound quality of a cell phone is nothing compared to what we're experiencing right now, and yet you're able to somehow reconstruct the signal. And this framework allows you to kind of analyze how much information this pair of devices can convey among itself. And what's really cool about this framework is that it can be applied to anything. It doesn't have to be a specific material instantiation like a cell phone. It can be things like DNA. How much information does DNA contain? How much information does the brain contain in different situations? And so people have actually used this to study the brain. And here we get into this very kind of incestuous level of analysis where you're studying patterns in the thing that detects patterns to begin with. And so this is, each one of these little dots is the activity of a single neuron whenever it fires a quick burst of electrical discharge. And what these scientists have done is play the same message over and over and over again. So they take one message, let's say a clip from a movie, and they see how this neuron responds to it. And they do so, in this case, 200 times, and they see at what times do I get a little blip of activity, and they mark it with a black dot. And so, you know, when you look at this, well, what kind of patterns do you see here? What is the pattern content of this picture?
Vertical disparity in the density of vertical bands.
Okay, so you see like vertical bands. Anything else?
You can also see horizontal bands, like where there isn't anything, like lines across it.
Yeah, so you see both vertical and horizontal bands, and the reason you see vertical bands is because every time you come to the moment 1600, so the 1600th second of this movie, something happens in that movie that causes the neuron to become active. And so this happens repeatedly across all trials, and the reason that you see horizontal bands is that sometimes the neuron just seems to be tired. It just doesn't activate that trial. So you have these long stretches of time where in this trial of the movie, the neuron simply doesn't activate. And so the way that information theory is used in this context is that it comes back to this issue of control. You control what is coming into the neuron by playing this movie over and over and over again, saying that I've controlled the world of this neuron. And so every time I see some sort of response, I can say that there's some sort of signal in this movie that this neuron is picking up on. Yeah?
Why does it not habituate? You should see over time the response going down and being less.
Yeah, and so this concept of habituation relates to what we were talking about early, how you can get used to certain things, like the hum of the projector or the color of the floor. And often what you see in the brain is that neurons kind of get used, whenever you get used to some aspect of the environment, neurons become silent. They kind of adapt. But what we see is that different neurons adapt differently. So for example, if you look in the retina, cells adapt very quickly to things like light intensity. But depending on the part of the brain, these variables change all over the place. And
Right.
so, kind of the other side of it is the extent to which you don't see vertical bands, these horizontal lines or these little deviations in spacing, these are all considered noise according to Shannon's approach. And that's because this movie isn't able to completely control what this neuron is doing, and this would be said to be some sort of noise in the system.
Yeah, so I mean, like, I guess the more sophisticated thing to do to look at something like this would be to look at a cluster of neurons, right? Because the basis isn't necessarily one neuron of information. It could be a cluster for which any one neuron doesn't play as big a huge role, and you might see consistent. You might see the same pattern plus or minus a couple neurons consistent.
Yeah, and so this kind of begs the question, like, how do we know the language here? We already saw, even in this example, it can be kind of tricky to say what is the signal? What is the signal made of? Like if you take RAED, what does it convey? You can only really understand what the signal is in the larger context of what's going on around, of what we know about the English language, what we know about what words mean. And so now we go to a picture like this, and you just see little blips. The cell is somehow like emitting these beams of electricity, and how do we begin to make sense of that? How do we begin to become confident about what this neuron is encoding? And we can go back actually to an earlier reading. If you remember the dark energy paper from earlier in the semester, it put out a whole bunch of very kind of interesting numbers saying that your retina is getting in 10 billion bits a second, and eventually that gets reduced to 10,000 by the time it gets to the cortex, and then eventually the contents of your perception are 100 bits. And so analysis is kind of based on these ways of characterizing neural activity. And so, as Chris points out, it's very limited. Like, how can you really make a statement like this is the number of bits in the brain if you don't really know the language of the brain? And so, to get kind of more of this other aspect of information, we can think of information not in terms of a scientific quantity, but in terms of what it means to us. How many of you see something in this? Wow, okay. And how many of you saw something immediately? How many of you don't see something?
How many people who saw something have seen this before?
Well, congratulations. So this is kind of another example of how readily we find patterns in the environment. So even if you take an image like this, and you can think of this actually as some sort of representation, let's say, of neural activity, how would we begin to assign some sort of structure to this random set of splotches? And that is kind of the challenge that scientists face, because here we can take advantage of our knowledge of the world, the fact that we've seen millions of dogs, and how the visual scene is organized, and yet when we look at something like neural activity, we can't resort to those ways of interpreting the code. And so meaning kind of takes on a different meaning when you look at different brains. So this is drawings of a cat that were produced by someone who progressively became more and more schizophrenic over the period of several years. And he kept on drawing many, many cats over the course of the progression of his disease. And this is what they started off as, something that we all can readily identify with. And over time, these cats seem to develop these crazy layers of meaning that weren't readily apparent to those of his peers. Eventually coming to this point where the physical construction of these cats was completely abstract. And so when you look at a picture like this, you can ask, what is the set of associations that is creating this image in this person's brain? What is meaning for this person who has such an affinity for cats? And just to kind of give you another example of how we have many, many layers of meaning in pretty much everything that we sense. I'll give you another example. So I'm going to play you a sentence.
The sounds as they appear to you are not only different from those that are really present, but they sometimes behave so strangely as to seem quite impossible.
Okay, so here you heard a sentence. And now I'm going to continue playing it, and we'll see what happens.
The sounds as they appear to you are not only different from those that are really present, but they sometimes behave so strangely as to seem quite impossible. But they sometimes behave so strangely, they sometimes behave so strangely, 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 sometimes behave so strangely.
And on. So how did your kind of experience of that sentence change?
It became musical.
It became musical.
Yeah, essentially she was kind of singing.
And it turns out like pretty much like any sentence that I'm speaking right now exhibits similar fluctuations of tonality. And so this, I would posit, is an example of how we have multiple layers of information that are beaming out at each other all the time. And so to kind of explore these different layers of meaning as they differentiate different people who might have different kind of psychologies, as they differentiate different layers of connection between physical systems, we're going to do a quick demonstration outside. And before we get there, I'll just show you one last picture. And that's of a biochemical network. So there's several thousand molecules that are influencing each other every second of every day inside of a cell. And this kind of begins to show how many different layers of meaning or association even the smallest structures inside of us can have. So every moment of every day, your cells are engaged in these very, very dense interactions that are unfolding moment by moment. And so if you try to ascribe meaning to this, not only is it very difficult scientifically, but you can see how many, many different layers of meaning can be embodied in the same structure. So what we will do right now is take ourselves outside. I want you to kind of like blend into the campus and try to see how many different types of relationships you can see, how different people walk, how the different trees move, how the wind interacts with the people, how people find meaning in their world as they're walking around. And try to kind of disperse yourself a little bit so you aren't in one clump and you don't like get everyone weirded out. So just kind of spread a little bit across campus. Yeah, so we're going to be back here in like 10 minutes. So just like collect as many types of relationships as you can find in how people move, and then we'll
Have to look like a student. What?